Today's reading comes from Hebrews chapter 10, starting at verse 19 to 25. So it's Hebrews chapter 10, starting at verse 19. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I wonder how you respond when something doesn't meet your expectations. If you start reading a book or watching a programme on TV and it's not about what you thought it was about, or it's not as good as you thought it would be, do you stay with it because, well, you've started it now and it might get better, you might get into it? Or do you abandon it and start watching something else? If you've taken up a new hobby and you're not enjoying it, or it's harder work than you expected, do you give up after the first session, or do you persevere? And if you persevere, at what point do you decide it's not for you? If you've taken up parkour, that's jumping around between buildings, I think, how long do you keep persevering before you decide you really don't enjoy it and it's never going to be for you? When something doesn't meet our expectations, we reevaluate. Sometimes something's not for us. Sometimes we need to give it more time. Sometimes whatever it is needs to change. We need to give some feedback. And sometimes it's our expectations or perspective that needs to change. The context of the letter to the Hebrews is a community of believers who are experiencing persecution. And this is causing some members of the community to question their Christian faith. They're struggling to make sense of the trials they're facing when Jesus is the Messiah who's won the victory. So they're reevaluating their Christian faith. It's hard and it's not matching up with their expectations. They're reevaluating whether Jesus is actually the promised Messiah, and they're reevaluating whether worshipping together with other Christians is really that important given the risk of persecution. It's safest to stay away. The writer of the letter to the Hebrews wants them to reevaluate again, to rethink. They're deciding that Christianity, or church at least, is not for them, when actually they need to persevere. Jesus more than fulfills the old covenant, and it's the expectation and perspectives of the believers that needs to change. The very thing that they most need in the context of experiencing persecution is the very thing that some of the believers are distancing themselves from by giving up meeting together. That's verse 25 in the reading that Alenka read to us. What they need is not to give up. What they need is encouragement. We're in a sermon series, you'll know if you've been here over the past few weeks, on why church. And we're thinking today about encouraging one another. And there are three really helpful things that I think we can learn from this passage in Hebrews. It's Hebrews 10, 19 to 25. If you haven't got it open or up on your phone, I'd encourage you to do that so you can follow along as we go through. So three things I think we can learn from this passage about encouraging one another. The first is this: why encouragement is needed. The second is what the source of the encouragement is. And the third is how we are to encourage one another. So first up, why encouragement is needed. Encouragement is needed because being a Christian isn't easy. It wasn't 2,000 years ago, and it isn't now. It can be really hard in some workplaces to answer the question on a Monday morning about what you did on the weekend with saying that you went to church. It can be really hard amongst some of our friends and family to do that. There are countries in our world where publicly practicing your faith puts your life in danger. And even without experiencing ridicule or the threat of persecution, being a Christian, choosing to be faithful to God and trusting in his promises, then just working out life by deciding what I want and what's good for me, can be enormously costly. And we need encouragement to keep going. If you've ever thought that the Christian faith, that the Christian life is too demanding, that it doesn't live up to the expectations you have when you think of good news, or if you've questioned whether worshipping with other Christians is really that important, then take heart, because you're in the company of Christians in the 1st century AD, and I'd like to suggest every century since then. Being a Christian isn't easy. But the letter to the Hebrews reminds us that doubting or questioning or finding things hard doesn't mean you should give up. Sometimes we just need encouragement to keep going. I don't watch a lot of sport. In fact, I basically watch none. But I can often hear the cheers from the football stadium on a Saturday afternoon. Supporters make a difference. If you listen to an interview with an athlete or a player after they've won a game or a match or a race or an event or whatever sport it might be, they often mention the crowd, how the cheers of the crowd got them across the finishing line. The hardest part of a marathon is often not the physical exhaustion, but the mental exhaustion. And it's at the moment when a runner thinks they can go no further, it's too hard, that the encouragement of those around them gets them to the finishing line. If we look further ahead in chapter 10, just for a moment, look at verses 32 to 34, the writer reminds the community of believers that they have already endured and persevered through great suffering and persecution. This isn't a new situation. It's a how long, O Lord situation, to echo the words of the psalmist. So it's back to that question, when you decide to persevere with something, how long do you keep persevering until you decide to give up? Well, in this situation, what the writer of the Hebrews says is you persevere and then you persevere some more. When being a Christian is really hard, we might think the solution is giving up or distancing ourselves, taking a bit of extra space from church. But sometimes what we really need is the thing that we're actually staying away from. What we really need is the encouragement of the community of believers, the encouragement to keep going. So that's the first point, why encouragement is needed. Second point, what the source of encouragement is, and we're looking now at verses 19 to 21 in that reading from Hebrews 10. Encouragement is not just a positive feeling or an optimistic word. Everything's going to be all right, but I'm crossing my fingers and my toes because I'm not actually sure that it will be. The source of the encouragement, the reason to be encouraged and to encourage others, it's got roots. It's Jesus Christ. Some of the believers are doubting whether Jesus is the Messiah because he doesn't seem to be ruling as king as they expected. And the writer of the letter to the Hebrews responds by reminding them just of the extent of the blessings that they've received because of Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay, Jesus might not be ruling like king in the way they expected at this point in time, but actually, guys, you need to realize just what Jesus' death and resurrection has accomplished. In the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, only the high priest could enter the inner sanctuary, the most holy place, to offer a yearly sacrifice to atone for the sins of the people. Jesus is the great high priest who, in dying on the cross, has not only offered himself as a sacrifice once and for all, but has also made the way for all people to access God's presence. When Jesus' blood was shed on the cross, the temple curtain tore in two. You can read about that in either Matthew, Mark, or Luke's Gospel. Access to God's presence is no longer restricted. It's this new covenant where Jesus, the great high priest, is over and above the Old Testament priesthood, where yearly sacrifices are no longer required, and where all people are able to enter God's presence. That's the reason to be encouraged. That's good news. I was listening to, I think it was a podcast, but it might have been the radio. I listened to quite a few things and I can't always remember what I've heard where. And a reference was made to a quote I have heard before by 17th century philosopher, mathematician, writer, theologian. He did just about everything, Blaise Pascal. And Blaise Pascal was saying how you should respond to people who think that religion is incompatible with reason. And what he says is this: make people wish it were true, and then show that it is. And that's what we have here in Hebrews. Jesus, having given himself as the ultimate sacrifice for sin and made a way to access God's presence, people would wish that was true. And it is. That's the gospel. That's the good news. So that's the second point. The source of encouragement is Jesus Christ, having made it possible for us to be free from sin and having made it possible for us to freely enter God's presence. So, third point, how we are to encourage one another. In verses 22, 23, and 24, we have three let us statements. Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings. That's verse 22. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. Verse 23. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Verse 24. Then, having heard what we are to do, those letters statements, in verse 25 we hear what we're not to do. Do not give up meeting together, as some of you are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. I don't know if you noticed the pattern of the let us verses. Faith, hope, and love. We're to meet together and encourage one another in faith, hope, and love. Together, we draw near to Jesus with the confidence that faith brings, that we know who Jesus is, the Son of God, and what he's done for us, that our sins are forgiven. When we meet together like this, we encourage one another in faith, in those things. Together, we hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. A hope where we don't have all the answers, but we trust in the one who does. We trust that God is faithful. When we meet together like this, we encourage one another in hope that God keeps his promises. And although life might be really hard right now, there will be a time when Christ returns and reigns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, when there'll be no more suffering, no more dying, no more injustice. That's what we do when we're together. We encourage one another in hope. Together, We spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Our faith moves us to action, bringing God's love to the world. When we meet together, we encourage one another in love. We build each other up and send each other out to go and show God's love to others. That's what we do when we are together. We encourage one another in love. All of us will face times when we need encouragement, when being a Christian feels particularly costly, and we have doubts and questions, and church should be a place where we experience that encouragement. But for this to happen, to receive encouragement and to give encouragement, to be held in a community where we're pointed to Jesus, where we're reminded of faith and hope and love, we need to show up for one another. It's only going to work if we all show up for each other, to not give up meeting together. Often I think we sometimes associate encouragement with having achieved something. When someone says thank you, or when someone says something affirming, or we receive a compliment maybe. But the source of our encouragement is not anything any of us do. It's Jesus Christ. That's open to all of us. We can all give and receive the encouragement that we have in Jesus Christ. It's not dependent on anything we do. It's all about our relationship with Jesus, pointing one another to Jesus. That's what encouraging one another is about. So where does this leave us? It might be that we need to reevaluate, we need to rethink. Perhaps with distance or are distancing ourselves from church, when really actually what we need is the encouragement of being with the community of believers. If you're in that place, speak to me, speak to one of the team, receive prayer ministry after the service. It might be that we need to be reminded of the source of our encouragement. Jesus, he died for you. You can freely enter God's presence. That's good news. That's the source of our encouragement. It's not anything you or I can do. It's Jesus Christ that's the source of our encouragement. That's what we encourage one another with when we meet together. It might be that we need to be challenged on how we can encourage one another, how we can point one another to Jesus. It's easy when we go anywhere just to talk to the people we know, to our friends. But actually, encouragement is about building up the whole church community in faith, in hope, and in love. Perhaps we need to be challenged on how we can do that. Life is hard. As I've been speaking, I've been thinking about a book by Catherine Welby. She's the Archbishop of Canterbury's daughter. And the book has the title, I Thought There Would Be Cake, which I think is a rather great title. And what she writes about is how adult life hasn't turned out as she expected. I thought there would be cake. When life doesn't turn out as we expect, when our faith journey isn't what we expected it would be, and I suspect that will be true for all of us at one point or another, when there are more lows than there are highs, do we stay away from church because that feels easiest or safest? Or do we come to church to be encouraged and to encourage others? Remembering that the source of our encouragement is not anything we can do or anything we bring. The source of our encouragement is Jesus Christ.